The Black Death. Pestilence, the Great Plague, one of the most tragic events in all of human history. Europe was hit the hardest, losing around 50% of its population, and many settlements had disappeared in their entirety. It took the continent over 200 years to recover, and some areas even more. The Black Plague changed the world from the core, shifting philosophy, science, and religion. So, what was it? The Black Death encompasses a tragic period for Europe between 1346 and 1353, and for the rest of the world a decade or so prior. The topic is still up for debate, and there are many competing theories of what caused it, but the current consensus is the most legitimate one. The disease itself is caused by Yersinia pestis, which resulted in several forms of the plague. The most well known is the bubonic plague, but there were also the septicemic and the pneumonic plague that operated around the same time. It was a devastating disease, most notable for inflamed lymph nodes that could be the size of an apple. They would spread all over the body, oozing pus, and very high fever would be present, with the victim dying a very painful death 2 to 7 days after the infection. The other two were even worse, and they would progress so much faster that the lymph nodes wouldn't even have the time to become prominent. Pneumonic plague targeted the lungs, while the septicemic turned the skin purple. Without getting into too much medical detail, it was a horrific disease that acted very swiftly and left no room at the time for any treatment. The way it was transmitted was through fleas. The bacteria would create a blockage within the fleas, turning them aggressive in order to get rid of it. In turn, they would utilize two populations of rodents, one resistant to the disease acting as hosts, and another one lacking such resistance. Both would carry the bacteria, the first keeping the plague around, but when the second died out, the fleas would spread to other hosts, including humans. As humans only realized the actual importance of hygiene much later on, closer to the 19th century, many of the cities of the time lacked proper sanitation, so this greatly helped the disease spread in such a terrible number. The actual origin of the plague is unclear. The most likely theory is that it came from Asia, but recent DNA analysis found the bacteria in Sweden dating up to 3000 BC. Still, the most credible sources point to Kaffa, a port in Crimea. The Mongol horde is laying siege to the city, but at the same time it is suffering from the pestilence themselves. Greatly demoralized, they decided to share their torment, and thus they catapulted the infected corpses over the defensive walls. Merchants and civilians had escaped, first spreading the plague to Constantinople and then via Genoese ships to Italy. In January 1348, they had reached Genoa and Venice, transmitting it to northern Italy, while at the same time one ship had sailed to France. From then on, it was absolute and utter chaos. By June 1348, the plague was in Portugal, Spain, England, Germany, and a few years later, it had even reached Scotland and Scandinavia. The death toll for Europe is very hard to estimate due to the lack of proper documentation, but it is said to be around 50%. However, that is not proportional in the slightest. Worst hit were cities and trade hubs that were well connected, while less connected and more distant areas such as Germany or England are put around 20%. Yet, despite that, even in those areas, some cities were one of the largest victims of the Black Plague. Mediterranean Europe was hit the hardest, as the plague ran consecutively there for over 4 years, with Italy, southern France, and Spain losing in some areas up to 80% of their population, if not even more. Half of the populace of Paris was wiped out, while the population of Florence went from 120,000 down to less than 50,000. Hamburg and London lost at least 60%, and many settlements had disappeared in their entirety. While we know today what happened, and we know that it was most likely the same bacteria that was responsible for the just as devastating plague of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century, the people at the time had no clue and were in a collective state of shock. It had spread so quickly that people were dying left and right. In certain cities, most doctors and morticians fell victim to the pestilence, and no one dared to even touch the bodies, leaving the streets filled with corpses. The death rate was so high that giant pits had to be dug up to be able to bury all of the victims. The Italian chronicler recorded his experience from Siena. Father, abandoned child. Wife, husband. One brother, another. For this illness seemed to strike through breath and sight. No one could be found to bury the dead for money nor friendship. Great pits were dug and piled deep with a multitude of the dead. There was no one who wept for the dead, for all had awaited death. The people had no clue what hit them. The greatest authority and the most widely accepted theory at the time was that it was spread through foul air. Initially, doctors attempted herbs and various treatments. Plague doctors became prominent with their notable beaks with the purpose of preventing this foul air from infesting them. Of course, none were effective, and soon dread set into the populace that there was no cure for this illness. People really thought it was the end times and they had turned to rituals and religion. Christianity at the time saw this either as the end of the world as we know it and for a way to reach eternal life, or as God punishing us for immorality. Even Muslims had accepted this view, and some even banned attempting to treat the disease, seeing it as a punishment from God that they must endure. The way people coped was diverse. A slighter version, Christian cults had emerged that whipped themselves and chanted while walking through the streets in order to pay for the sins of humanity. However, real fanaticism began in the forms of persecution and laying the blame on someone else. Various groups were targeted, from any foreigners to beggars, gypsies, and even people with acne, and they were all subjected to terrible massacres and tortures. The Jews fared the worst, with attacks on their communities across all of Europe. In the infamous Strasbourg massacre, as much as 2,000 Jews were murdered, and by 1351, over 200 Jewish communities had been entirely annihilated. Ultimately, in 1351, the pandemic came to a halt with the aid of newly introduced quarantines and the fact that the plague killed so many that it kinda burned itself off. Still, it never actually disappeared. From then on, it would constantly return and would wipe out city after city until the 18th century, although never again on such a large or nearly a global scale. Nonetheless, it was almost always present, at least somewhere on Earth, at least in one city. It would reoccur in China in a big number in the 1850s and even in San Francisco in the 1900s. The bacteria actually exist to this day, and there are cases happening at the current year, albeit in a very minor number, and Yersinia pestis isn't nearly as scary because today we know how it works, we know what it is, and we have vaccines and antibiotics. Nonetheless, the Great Plague that happened in the 14th century was one of the most crucial moments in all of human history. It literally changed society to the core. First, economically, as at the height of the pandemic, no one wanted to work and the fields were left unattended, so the workers charged 4 to 5 times their regular wages, which eventually started bankrupting the landowners, thus slowly breaking the feudal system. As almost every family suffered casualties, peasants inherited large swaths of land and started gaining more and more influence. These two combined significantly altered the hierarchy and the societal structure of the time. Furthermore, some attributed the start of the Renaissance to the Black Death. As death was so prominent, thinkers began focusing on their current life on Earth, they began doubting God, and Christianity slowly started losing their grip on education. This all led to the development of philosophy, science, and the subsequent revolutions. Of course, there were many other factors, but many see this crucial event as the catalyst. It took Europe hundreds of years to recover after this catastrophe, and some areas of Italy took even longer. While plagues did occur constantly since then, the main reason the Black Plague was so disastrous was that it caught everyone off guard. By the 14th and the 17th century, the people were more familiar with the disease, and their views had shifted. There were better systems in place to stop a widespread pandemic, despite there being no cure at the time. The Pestilence was an excellent representation of why knowledge is so important, as just imagine how different history would have been had there been a cure in the 14th century and had the people known what a bacteria was. Thank you for watching. Check out why the Spanish flu was so devastating by clicking on the screen, and also check out our Instagram page for daily facts. See you next time.